So, welcome to the Blue Mountains Public Library, a virtual author talk with Natalie Jenner. My name is Emma. I am the manager of public services at the Blue Mountains Public Library. Natalie Jenner is a Canadian author of two novels, the international bestseller, The Jane Austen Society, and she has an upcoming book in May 2022, the Bloomsbury Girls, coming out this spring, which we are all very excited for. And basically, Natalie, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Oh, hi Emma, hi everybody in Collingwood and
we're in Thornbury.
You're in Thornbury, sorry, yeah.
No, it's okay. We get it all the time, but it's the town of the Blue Mountains is officially.
That's right.
But we're really close to Collingwood.
And yes, because people in Collingwood have been sending me the newspaper, which I thought was hilarious. Like, look, you're in the newspaper for the library. Sorry. So, anyways, really lovely to be here, and I hope everyone had as beautiful a day as I did because it was a stunner. Yeah.
Which is great. So I just wanted to kind of dive right in. The Jane Austen Society, I hope everyone has had a chance to read it. We cannot keep it on the shelf. It comes in and it goes right back out. There has been a waiting list since it was published in May 2020, I believe. It is very popular. It is set in the 1940s about a small group of people whose common interest is Jane Austen and preserving her legacy. And Natalie, I would just love to know what led you to write this book.
Well, it was very interesting because I did not know I was going to write this book. I was really just coping with some difficult family medical news by rereading Jane Austen, which is something I had done throughout my life, always more for pleasure or distraction. And during this time in my life, I just found that I really wanted to just read her over and over again. And then I was like, why do I want to do that? And then what is it about her writing? And then once I figured, once I kind of got through the reading of the books, I was like, well, what is it about her and her life? And so the inspiration for the book really came from a quiet year in my life where I immersed myself fully in her as a way of receiving solace and comfort during a tricky time, which was actually 4 years ago now. So well before the pandemic started, which was, I think one of the great ironies with this book is how it thematically, sadly, connects and relates, I think, for a lot of people to this time. So I basically kind of reached a point after a year of thinking and reading about her, of some stability in our family life. And I felt like writing again for the first time. I had tried for many years when I was younger to get published and it hadn't worked out. And I remember wanting to explore who is it that saves history? What is that initial spark? What kind of person? People like me who maybe were going through a difficult time in life, bonding over books and finding solace from books. I wanted to explore that. And writing has always been the place, my safe place that I go to where I can do really deep, like psychological work on myself, but not be conscious of it. Like I have a really fun time. And then when the book is done, I look back and I go, whoa, you were really upset about that when you wrote that chapter. But at the time, it's actually really therapeutic and really fun. So that was how it kind of came about.
That's amazing. So when you wrote this book, it really goes into depth, and I feel it was very accurate historically. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of research you have to do to write a book like this?
Well, again, I think because I hadn't actually planned to write the book, the research, fortunately for me as a writer, had already been done in this really fun way, in a very loose way. So I never kept notes. And in fact, when it came time to copy editing and they're like, well, where did you get this? And I was like, oh my God, because I didn't flag anything. So I had to almost reread some of the books to verify things. But all the book is based on the idea of what in real life was the first Jane Austen Society, which formed in 1940 actually, and tried to save the cottage during the war and were unable to raise funds. And then a lawyer who had lost his son in battle in real life donated the house to the nation. And so what happened with my book was I sort of took a lot of the historical facts and nuances and sort of threw them in a Moulinex blender, so to speak, and out came my characters and my plot events. So it's very made up in terms of the people and their lives and their choices. But what's very what's very real are the artifacts, the actual cottage, the way, anything I described physically is there and you can go see it. And one of the most fun things for me, Emma, is when people like message me and are like, here I am, I'm at Chawton House. I'm in the window seat and they have a copy of my book, and it's very mind blowing. So from a research perspective, I did it in a very free way so that when I sat down to write, my characters really drove everything. I wasn't thinking consciously of how do I fit this in, or what do I want to convey about the real thing. I really just went with my characters, and they really took over, which is, I don't outline when I write. I very much just start typing. So I follow my characters and want to know what happens to them. So that was how this, kind of came about in terms of the research piece.
That's amazing to hear. It's really cool to hear, like, every writer has their own way of doing things. And it's really cool to hear you can just sit down and kind of write it out and not even having the notes from it. So that's incredible. Were you actually there at Jane Austen's cottage?
Yes, I had for many decades known about and visited the Jane Austen's House Museum, which is her actual cottage. I had for many years also wanted to go inside Chawton House, which is actually ironically almost the main setting of the book. And that's where Frances lives and where Evie works as a servant. And for some reason, Chawton House opened in 2003. The Jane Austen's House Museum opened in 1949. And I just never got into Chawton House. And I remember becoming kind of obsessed. And when we were going through this difficult time in life, my husband was diagnosed with an incurable form of lung disease, and we were quite young family still, and we were taking like bucket list trips and renewing our vows in Italy and doing very really amazing things as a family. But my husband also went and golfed in Augusta, Georgia with the guys. And I was like, well, wait a minute, if we're doing stuff like that, I would love to go finally and get inside Chawton House and spend a week on my own in this village so that I could really sink myself into her life, really pay homage to her, and really thank her for getting me through this really difficult time. And so I went for a whole week, and every day I was the first person to arrive at the cottage in the morning. I would go see her little table, her little round table. It's like 14 inches diameter, and you just have this image of a desk. It's this little table, and they have it positioned right by this window. And out the window, you can see the intersection of the roads that go to Winchester and London. And you can imagine her sitting there, her authorial eye, and her looking out onto the hubbub of her village, and just obviously being a people watcher and her absorbing that. So that's always an incredible experience. And then I would leave the museum after I had seen everything again. And also, Emma, taking my time. I don't know if you have children, but it's like you're in museums, you don't always get to read everything. And I would like sit there and I was like reading every line on the cards. And then I went up the street every afternoon. I would have tea in the courtyard, just like Dr. Gray and Adeline. And then I would go through the house and I would walk through the grounds, and I would play in these earbuds the soundtrack to the Colin Firth Pride and Prejudice movies. I was like so channeling it. And I think it really got into me, and everything that I saw, actually the first day I went to Chawton House, because I went 5 days in a row, but the first day I went, I was there for 2 hours because I had traveled from Bath. And everything I saw that afternoon, I put in my book. It was like it was meant to be. It was just really fun.
That's amazing. So you sat where she sat and you saw what she would have seen, It's very interesting. So were you already writing the book when you went to, or is this where it all kind of came from?
No, it wasn't even a glimmer in my eye at that point. Wow. I think I was 3-4 months into really being quite obsessed with Jane. And I think it started in earnest in May of 2017, when things were getting really difficult with my husband's diagnosis. There was genetic implications and second opinions, and it was a murky 1.5 to 2 years of full diagnosis of what is a very rare disease. It usually does take years for people to find out what they have. So I was really kind of, I think, turtling socially around spring of 2017. I go to see the cottage in the fall of 2017. My family thinks I'm going to come back cured of my addiction. And I come back with a suitcase full of more books. They're like all over there. And then I just sat there and kept reading about her. And then a year later, in April of 2018, I went for my 50th birthday with my daughter to Philadelphia. I wanted to go to my first Jane Austen Society of North America meeting. There's sort of like Dive Bond, a regional Jane Austen Society meeting in East Pennsylvania. And everyone was talking about persuasion at this conference, and they were talking about the theme of grief. And I remember thinking, oh, that's what I'm in. I'm in a weird state of grief, like fear of the loss of my husband. And weirdly, it's kind of what a lot of people say people in the pandemic have been experiencing, which is, it's called anticipatory grief. It's basically the loss of the future that you thought you were going to have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a unique form of grief. Nowhere near as bad as the very physical loss of someone that you love, but hard to pin down. And I came home from that trip in Philadelphia. My daughter said a couple weeks later, I went, I'm going to write a book about a group of people that come together to save Jane Austen's house. And that is like still how they summarize my book. And it came to me like in a light bulb. And I sat down and started to write. So.
That's amazing. I love to hear about how the idea came and how it came from your own personal kind of turmoil, but then you built this book that has brought so many people together. That's incredible. So when you were researching, can you tell me like what was the most surprising thing that you learned?
Well, I think one of the reasons I was reading so much about her is because I kept being surprised. I mean, one of the things about Jane Austen, when I first discovered her, it was around 1980, there was a BBC miniseries based on Pride and Prejudice. And Darcy is one of those sort of like Rhett Butler and Gone with the Wind, like that kind of like comes at you in adolescence and you're just like, whoa, what's that? Right? It's just like, it sort of like rockets you, you know, in your hormones. And I think I was a young lawyer when the Colin Firth came out. And during this period of the 80s and 90s, there were more and more adaptations. And I think what happened was she got a bit co-opted culturally in that shorthand that we like to use when we try to get people excited in media about things as a chick flick, woman's writer, romantic writer. And what I was most surprised by in my research was how historically her biggest fans had often been men. The men had been the caretakers of her legacy, and the men had provided the first critical review of her. And, you know, you could argue that with a lot of writers from the 1800s, primarily because men dominated academia and review circles. But there was something about Jane Austen that really appealed to lawyers in particular. And I was really fascinated by that as a lawyer, former lawyer myself, non-practicing. I have to say that, the law society is like, I don't practice. And I was really interested in what it was then about her that men were responding to. Not the fact that they could respond to her, but that we had lost that culturally. So I was surprised by that. And I think I wanted to reclaim that real history with my book. There's two other things, though, Emma, that I was really surprised by. The first was the degree of poverty and homelessness that she experienced, in addition to her ill health. I mean, she had a diagnosis of, like, we don't know what. I don't think they knew at the time what she was suffering from. I mean, the theories are run from, you know, leukemia, Addison's disease. So she was one of those people at a time in history where, you know, she was suffering and they didn't know ever. And that's obviously very taxing on the mental condition. So I wasn't prepared for the degree to which she had both been suffering ill health for as long as she did, but also the degree to which she was completely dependent, along with her sister and her mother, on the largesse of their brothers and sons. That she really, if they didn't give her a roof that month in Southampton with the pregnant wife and help with the baby and everything, you know, if her brother didn't do that, I don't know, you know, where they would have gone. And I think the corollary of that, of what else, the final thing that really surprised me in my research was the fact that during that period of homelessness and unsettlement for her, which runs from her father's death, about 1801, until she gets the cottage that her brother gives her and her mother and her sister. Cottage that's on the front of my book. In about, I think it's like 1809, in summer of 1809. Until that happens, she, as far as we know, wrote very little. And we know she started the Watsons and she kind of got about 15,000 words out, but that's all we have from like almost a decade. And then the minute she moves into that house, she revises and publishes Sense and Sensibility in 1811. Pride and Prejudice in 1812, writes from scratch and publishes, you know, Mansfield Park, writes from scratch and publishes Emma, and writes from scratch and publishes Persuasion, and does all of that in a 6-7 year period, which is one of the greatest records of, you know, 6 masterpieces in a row in such a short period of time. And I remember being really moved in my research and thinking about how she was coping with uncertainty in her life, and how any kind of certainty had given her the freedom and joy of writing back. And I remember being both surprised and very inspired by that. And as I say these words to you, Emma, it does occur to me that it was probably that very example of her, that the minute we had a little bit of stability, my husband was put on very expensive drugs that the Trillium Exceptional Access Program in Ontario fortunately covers. And he started to show some stability. And we weren't expecting that. We'd been told he only had 2 to 3 years of life left. And when that happened, it was just enough certainty to look at the next day and maybe even look at the next month. And we hadn't felt that for a while. Mm-hmm. And I think that the experience of seeing how Jane Austen had derived an impetus from her settling down, being able to settle down, I think really inspired me and made me maybe lit a fire under me and maybe made me go, okay, you got a little karmic break here from the universe. You better do something with it.
That's really incredible. It's a great story. And it's interesting when you say learning about her, because those things come across in her writing, the impoverished, waiting on their family to take care of them, needing their family to take care of them, and Sense and Sensibility, with the sister. And a lot of her personal life seemed to come through in her writing, which is amazing as well. Yeah. I was actually named after Austen's Emma. So
no,
I do have a personal attachment to her as well.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, which is great. It's a very popular name now, but I wonder how many people think about, because for me, Emma is always going to be Jane Austen. So yeah. That's incredible. So moving away from your own book, you mentioned you had been a lawyer, but you also owned a bookstore in Oakville. Yeah. And I was just really curious because I'm a huge fan of independent bookstores. We have a wonderful little one in Thornbury called Jessica's Book Nook that we work with frequently. And I just wondered, how did it help you writing a book, having owned a bookstore?
It's really interesting because when I opened the bookstore and people were like, oh, do you write? Do you have books? And I'm like, my books are not good enough for my bookstore. I'm not putting my unpublished books on these shelves. But I remember noticing things when I was running the shop that helped me today, actually, more than before, with the 3 books I've written since that time, because I'd written 5 before I owned the shop. And with the 3 I've written since that time, what owning the bookshop did for me was that phrase decoupled. It kind of decoupled the process of writing and loving writing from the process of publication and what gets published. And it showed me how many books come out. I mean, the reps come in, and this from, being in a library situation at Thornbury, like it's just coming at you like this, like it's like the mail, it just never stopped. And I remember feeling that it would be very difficult with my books that I had written for anybody to really break them out in the market. And I remember not taking it so personally anymore, that it hadn't worked out. And I am here to tell anyone who's interested in writing that it is very actually helpful to have years of rejection, because you continue to get rejected. I mean, you get bad reviews, you get Goodreads 1 stars, you get manuscripts turned down, you get ideas turned down. It's just like a media, decides, oh, we're not going to cover you, we're going to cover the other Jane Austen book. Like it's constantly a very up and down. I mean, don't get me wrong, the highs are so great that the lows don't matter, but it's still really good to have exercised that rejection muscle. And I think owning the shop really showed me how many books are getting published, that not to take it so personally. It also showed me the power of Jane Austen, because whenever a book came out that had anything to do with Jane Austen, people come running in. And it also showed me the love of historical fiction, which I think in Canada is particularly a wonderful genre. We produce great historical fiction, and we welcome with open arms great historical fiction from around the world. And there is something about reading a book set in the past. I noticed with my customers that they loved learning about the past and being able to project themselves into it, and maybe in a way do the kind of work that I do when I'm writing, but feel that they were somewhere else while they're doing it. This is that distance, So yeah, it was a very eye-opening time for me.
That's great. So you were a lawyer, you owned a bookstore, and now you are a best-selling author. So that's incredible. And I had some questions about the publication, because the Jane Austen Society has been published in, I want to say 20 languages. Yeah. And it is, you had a Canadian publisher and then you got an American publisher? Is that?
No, it's actually, I'm a bit of a anomaly. I'm a Canadian who is published by an American publisher.
I would love to hear about that.
Yeah. So what happened was that, I had tried for years to get published, and I have set books in Canada, But with this book, knowing that it was set in England and it was historical fiction, I didn't think it mattered where I went. And actually, an independent bookstore owner in Canada and I were chatting once, and they were like, I'm really glad you went straight to New York, because that's kind of with this book, what you should have done. And so I went straight to applying, first of all, to agents in New York and London. And my agent at the time at Curtis Brown, which is one of the oldest literary agencies in the world, right down at the Flatiron Building at the time in New York, grabbed it sort of like in the summer of 2018. And then we sold at auction at Christmas time of 2018, around, I guess, early December. We sold at auction amongst a group of US publishers. No Canadians were involved. And so when it got released in North America, they did a special, nice international edition for Canada with the flaps. And that's the version we got. But the American market got the hardcover. And I'm distributed in Canada by a wonderful, amazing company called Raincoast. They were responsible for the first Harry Potter book, back in like the 90s. And they are the distributor up here for my books. So my publisher is American. I deal constantly with Americans. I was hoping to go down this fall to New York, but I think I'm going to be continuing to Zoom for a little while longer. But I have gone many times to meet them. I got to record, I don't know if you carry the audiobook at the library, but it's amazing. And I'm not as the writer, I say that as a listener. The narrator is a British actor, Richard Armitage. She does an amazing job. And I got to record in like their recording studio at Macmillan Audio one Christmas. So I went down an interview that's at the end of the audiobook. So I've really been able to really meet with and work actively with my team in New York. And at the same time, I have this great team at Raincoast that does feel like I have like very much a Canadian team behind me. So I'm very spoiled that way, which is, really wonderful. So.
Well, I wondered, because when you see the reviews on your book, these are being published in, People magazine and the LA Times. It just seemed to have, like, I wondered if this was, and obviously great success in the States. And what about internationally? Is that your New York publisher that kind of takes the book?
No, I only sold North American rights. A lawyer. So then we get to go and just go crazy. And I have agents all around the world. So I have a foreign rights agent based in New York, and then she works with co-agents on the ground in all the different territories. And so, she just contacted me on Friday and said, we sold Bloomsbury Girls in another country. We've sold in a handful already, and in Italy. And so she's out there working the world outside of North America. So that's really fun. So actually I have something like 22 different publishers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And so each one in a different country.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Well, actually, and sometimes it's language rights. So it's language rights throughout the world. So sometimes they're publishing, in different, in like the British, the UK got Commonwealth. So they're doing South Africa and Australia, New Zealand, et cetera. So things like that. Yeah.
That is very cool. That's cool to hear. And just you mentioning the audiobook, because the Jane Austen Society is on Libby. For any of our library users who are on Libby, the audiobook and the ebook are both available for download on Libby. There might be a waiting list like the print copy here, but just wanted you all to know that it is available on Libby.
And also, I just let everyone know, I got my website redone recently, and I have a heading called audio. And if you go on there, there's like 5 excerpts from the book. And at the first 5 chapters, you can kind of read bits of each of them. And that would give people, a chance to see whether it's worth waiting for, if there is a waiting list.
Well, it's good you like the narrator, because a narrator can really make or break an audiobook, and to hear that you enjoyed who your narrator was.
Well, actually, Emma, you'll find this funny, because when I was writing the book, we had gone down to Virginia the previous summer, and we had been watching on the little portable DVD player at the time, North and South, which is Elizabeth Gaskell BBC production with Richard Armitage. And when I was writing my book, when I was writing Dr. Gray in particular, I very much could picture his voice for the character. So when they asked me about narrators for the audiobook, they gave me a list of 4 women. And I was like, I'm trying to reclaim men here in Jane Austen. Half my characters are men, half are women. But most of the, like, if you were to count it up, there's more male dominant narrative voice and male scenes, like man talking to man scenes. And I said, have we thought about a male narrator? And they're like, well, who do you have in mind? I was like, oh, I don't know, Richard Armitage. And they're like, oh, we know him. And then they were able to, and they were able to get him. And I was just like,
that's incredible.
It was incredible. And he put a tweet out very popular. And you put a tweet out, could you message me? And people just like were losing their minds, and like they're like, go message him, girl. Like, what are you waiting for? Like, I was just like, it was really fun. It's my, look at that little brush, with Hollywood. That was really cool.
That's incredible. And then to think that you thought of him as a character and that's who you ended up getting. I also really appreciate that you had a male narrator, considering that it's, I feel like the author, if it's a female author, they usually try and line it up as your voice, but it's not your voice. It's your character's voice. So that's a great decision.
Yeah. And it was interesting because I mean, the genre lends itself more, I think, marketing wise, to a female, narrator as well. And I mean, the cover is very pretty. And I loved how Richard Armitage embraced narrating this book. Like, he had to do, women's voices, and he gave Yardley Sinclair like a Scottish accent, which I didn't even think of when I was writing the book. But of course, like, Richard's British, so he gives him the Scottish accent. I was like, okay, that's just so brilliant. And so he really threw himself into it, and to embracing so many different types of characters. That was so gratifying for me, and I was just so in awe. Felt very, very lucky that he was the one that narrated it.
And a little starstruck.
Oh yeah, I have no shame in admitting
definitely fangirl of the narrator. So recently I learned that you have been named an ambassador for the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, which I saw in the news and you had talked to me about as well. Can you talk a little bit about your ambassador role?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great organization, and really the role is to just promote awareness of it as much as possible. And again, appreciate, opportunities at events like this that involve libraries and communities, and how important literacy is to a community and to the individuals who may not have access to the tools that some of us are so fortunate to have. And the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation was started by a very successful businesswoman in Australia who just happens to be the fifth great niece of Jane Austen. And her name is Caroline Jane Knight. And she is the last person to actually grow up in Chawton House, the setting of my book. And she, is one of the Knights, the real life Knight family. Mine is completely fictional. And she and her volunteers have created what is essentially a virtual literacy organization where 100% of the money that they raise goes straight to literacy initiatives on the ground in the developing world. And so they will be, helping to provide books to a school somewhere in India, in an impoverished, village. And what they do is they partner with the local not-for-profits. And so that is how they're able to have it be global and have it be very much no cost to the donor, in terms of thinking your money might not be going completely to helping children especially learn how to read and love books. So it's this incredible organization. They're doing this really incredible thing right now where if you organize a virtual or in-person tea party, there's a draw and you can possibly win having Carolyn Zoom into your event. Or like Susanna Harker, who played Jane in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice. Like, it's really, they do these really fun things to try and raise funds. And it's a very impressive organization. I used to volunteer at a literacy center in Toronto when I was a young lawyer, the East End Literacy Center. And I was just thrilled when Carolyn asked me. I was thrilled she read the book. She said her family's completely supportive of it. And I was relieved and very thrilled.
That's incredible. It's kind of cool to think that a descendant of Jane Austen is reading your own fictional work about Jane Austen or her heritage. And it's really cool to get the feedback enough to be asked to be an ambassador for their program. Yeah. That's incredible. Yeah. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I actually was lucky enough to see your cover reveal for your new book, Bloomsbury Girls, coming out in May 2022, which the library is definitely going to pre-order. And I just wondered, is there a connection between the Jane Austen Society and Bloomsbury Girls?
Yes, there is actually. I think that I had written the epilogue to my book without giving too much away. I wanted to give everybody the ending that they deserved. But the one character that I kind of wanted to sort of like know what was going to happen to, because she was the youngest, was Evie, the servant girl. And when the Jane Austen Society came out and was an instant international bestseller, and my publisher is like, "What are you going to do next?" It's like, "Give us anything." It's like, no, they weren't, but they were like, "What are you working on?" And I was like, "Well, I was thinking about a story where Evie graduates and ends up working in a bookshop." And they were like, "Oh, that sounds interesting." So I went away and I was watching the movie of 84 Charing Cross Road. And I had given a first American edition to my publicist as a thank you when the Jane Austen Society came out. So it was on my brain. And watching the movie, and I was watching all these characters in this bookshop. And I was thinking, oh, there's such a rich story about everybody here. And so very soon, Evie became one of 9 characters. And there's 5 male managers in the store, and she'll be one of 3 female staff. And there's sort of a battle of the sexes going on. And the women are going to have their fill of it and decide they're going to take over the bookshop. And there's visits and appearances from some famous writers, such as Samuel Beckett and Daphne du Maurier, and Peggy Guggenheim's in there. It's like a really fun 1950 time period where women were sort of had that freedom of the war, sadly, on the home front, being given, responsibility that they hadn't before, and now the men are back. And this is going to, as we all know, actually, that early 50s are going to lead into what will really become, Simone de Beauvoir and Germaine Greer and all that kind of feminist journey that's ahead. And so I really had a lot of fun with this book. And my agent is still my agent, but at the time he said to me, 8 characters is a lot for Hollywood. Maybe not have so many. As I ended up counting, I had 9. Sorry, Mitchell.
Well, that's great. That's exciting. And can I ask, do you have anything else, future plans to write more? Are you going to continue with trying to write out fiction?
Yeah, I actually gave my agent just today the first third of my next book, which is going to follow another character from Bloomsbury Girls that you don't know yet.
Okay, very cool.
It's going to follow her into Italy in 1955. So
amazing. So continuing to kind of grow this universe almost that stems from Jane Austen.
Yeah, and I don't even know if it's intentional that I want to grow the universe. It's just that they feel very alive to me because I am such a character-driven author, and my fiction is character-driven fiction. There's no heads and freezers. Just like no thrills. There's plot twists, but it's very much about these people. And because they seem so alive to me, I never really leave them behind. Mm-hmm. And I want them to have happy endings, though. So I'm very careful about who I choose to follow. It's usually someone that's got sort of like the open envelope still in front of them, and they're not settled. And so with this next book, I think that'll be like a nice way of looking at it, is like a trilogy. Not really. Mm-hmm. But kind of, yeah.
Loosely a trilogy.
Loosely,
yeah. That's exciting, because sometimes when a book ends, and even if they got a happy ending, you still wonder, oh, and then what happened the next day? And it's nice to hear that you're continuing at least one of the characters' stories so we can find out more.
Yeah. And also sometimes I have guest appearances, like cameos in Bloomsbury Girls from some of the people in the Jane Austen Society. Not many, very strategically, very much serving the plot. But it was fun. When one of them showed up, I was like, oh, thank God you're back. I didn't know he was going to show up, and then he shows up, and I'm like, oh my God, I missed you so much. I could have so much fun today.
I missed you. Welcome back. Yeah. And that's incredible that it just is not even something you planned out. It just I love to hear that you're writing. Really, you hear about writers, it just kind of takes over. Yeah. And you're not even really in control anymore. Like the characters are they're there and they're coming through you almost.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Do you know an amazing Canadian South African writer, Bianca Murray?
I don't.
Okay, she's incredible. And she's her second book came out a couple of years ago. And she and I were doing an interview, and she is the same way. Her characters just show up. And we were both talking about how magical it is. And she said that when her character shows up, she sees the world through their eyes. It's like she's looking in through the back of their head. But when my characters show up, I feel like I'm looking down on them, like through a camera, like God. And if you look at my book, you'll see that often when the character is introduced, there's a visual of someone looking down on them. And that at first is me. And then the next question I always ask myself is, could anyone else be watching right now? And who would that be? And that was actually how Frances Knight and the Knight family came to fruition, because at first I just knew that Adeline and Dr. Gray in chapter 4, at the time, my second chapter, but it will become chapter 4. I knew they were in the courtyard and they're talking. And then I just had this image of myself looking through the window with all the stained glass at the people in the tea room when I had been there the previous fall. And then I was like, well, who else could be in that house? And then the whole story of Frances Knight and the Knight family kind of falls in my lap. And then that led to the whole story with Evie working there and what she was up to in the library. So you're not in control at all. And so it's really magical.
It's really cool to hear kind of the behind the scenes on how that is developed, and especially with so many characters and how one can lead to another and then kind of playing off each other and building a story. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Incredible. Well, I loved hearing about it. So on our final kind of thing I wanted to talk about is that we are celebrating Ontario Public Library Week here and Canadian Library Month in general.
Yes.
And I just wondered, are you yourself a library user? And if so, do you have any favorite memories you can tell us about a public library?
Well, I am very much a library user. I grew up in Oakville, and I think the Oakville Public Library, the flagship that's down by the harbor, opened, I think, around the year after I was born. And we moved here from England in the 1970s. And my mother used to take us to this flagship, library downtown, and you could see the boats through the windows, and the children's library, is in the sort of the lower level. And then I live in Oakville now as an adult. I moved away for a couple of decades, but I came back when my daughter was 7. She says one of her great memories is us going after school or on Sunday afternoons. She goes, you would let me get out a big bag of books, and then we would go get an ice cream after. And that is like exactly what I did at that same library. The other thing I loved about the library system in Oakville when I was growing up in the 70s was there was a library mobile. Like, Emma, like, are you aware of that?
Yes, I wish we had one.
Oh,
Honestly.
it
I
was
wish
like
we did.
in the summertime. I mean, I'm one of those people that gets excited when the knife sharpening truck comes through the neighborhood and makes the sound. Like, I'm just so happy. There's like something new's coming and it's musical, like, the ice cream truck. And the bookmobile would come, and you would go up like these little steps, and you'd go in, and it's small. It has that gypsy caravan kind of feel to it. And I remember in the summertime, that was one of my absolute most favorite things to do. And also the great thing about libraries for me, I was a really precocious bookworm. Like, I went through, more than one book a day when I was little. So for my parents, what was great was we would do the same thing. It was like a bushel of books. Like, you would lug home this whole thing of books. And if you were reading as much as I was, it was such a gift to be able to just plow through a bunch of them, take it back, and get a bunch out more. And it's one of the great privileges of having a library in your community, because you can try different things as well.
Mm-hmm.
You can read things, and you're not investing in the cost of the book, and you trip across sometimes your favorite authors that way. So
definitely. And I feel like the libraries is one of the last places that you can go and you're not expected to spend any money, and you're free to kind of do what you need to do. And libraries aren't just about books anymore. We have a gallery here. We have a museum, but it is really about the books still for me in particular. And we have a wonderful collection. So it's been wonderful. But I also love to do events like this. And I just want to thank you so much for joining us on Zoom and virtually. It's a weird time to be doing programming, but I want to thank everyone for joining us, taking the time tonight and coming in.